Well, we'll go ahead and get started. I want to welcome all of you to another edition of SEBA's Reader Meet Writer. My name is Wiley Cash. I'm the writer in residence at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. I'm a novelist, and I'm also the 2019 recipient of SEBA's Pat Conroy Legacy Prize. SEBA stands for the Southern Independent Booksellers Alliance, and this is an organization that represents just under 700 independently owned bookstores throughout the Southeast. And perhaps you are here tonight for Mary Lawson's event because you are both a fan of her books and you are also a fan of the independent bookstore that brought you here tonight. So please reward both the author and the bookstore by purchasing Mary's books from the bookstore that brought you to tonight's event. The literary culture is sustained by our small independently owned bookstores, and we need them now more than ever, and they can use your help more than ever. Reader Meet Writer is a wonderful series we've been doing since July. We've hosted dozens and dozens of authors in front of literally thousands and thousands of people. These are authors who would otherwise be in your stores or in your libraries or at your universities or maybe even at your book clubs in person. But none of us can do that because of COVID. So we are doing our best and we are bringing writers to you. You're still getting to hear about their books. You're still getting to order their books. And if you try a little extra hard, you can probably get some signed books. But this has been a wonderful series, and I want to thank all the bookstores, all the booksellers, and all the readers for continuing to support it. And I want to let everyone know that Thursday, in a couple of days, at 7 p.m., we'll be hosting Denny S. Bryce to discuss her novel, Wild Women and the Blues. Thursday, April 1st at 7 p.m., Denny S. Bryce will be with us for Reader Meet Writer. And tonight, as I said, we have Mary Lawson. I am very excited about this. She is joining us all the way from England, so she is 5 hours ahead of us. So maybe at the end of tonight's broadcast, she can tell us what the future is like if she is willing to share that with us. If it looks any better at 11 p.m. than it does here in the States, hopefully it does. I don't know. Maybe something great will happen. But if you have questions for her tonight, at any point during our discussion, go down to the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen and type your question in there. When you type in your question, make sure to mention your first name and your home independent bookstore, and I will ask Mary your question, say your name, give your bookstore a shout out at the end of tonight's show. So don't hesitate as questions arise. Make sure you type them in. Questions for the visiting writer, that is the best part because that is, we don't know what's going to happen. It feels spontaneous and original. And all of us spend a lot of time thinking about, talking about, and living with our books. And we love these small moments where you get to take the work off of our shoulders. So make Mary's shoulders a little lighter tonight by asking some great questions, and don't hesitate. But I want to introduce Mary Lawson. She is a Canadian novelist born in Southwest Ontario. She spent her childhood in Blackwell, Ontario, and is a distant relative of L.M. Montgomery, author of Anne of Green Gables. She moved to England after graduating university with a psychology degree, and she has two grown sons that now live nearby, if I'm not mistaken. And this is her new novel. It is A Town Called Solace, and this is her third novel. And Mary, thank you so much for joining us from the future. I really appreciate it.
It is such a pleasure to be here and also to be supporting independent bookstores in any way at all, because as you say, they are the foundation of keeping culture and literature alive. And it's wonderful to be here. It takes me a long time to write a book, 5 or 6 years, 6 years in terms of Solace. And you don't know while you're writing it, or at least I certainly don't, whether anybody's ever going to want to read it. Mm-hmm. So the idea of speaking to people about it and having actual questions from people who might wish to read it is just lovely. After all this time, it's contact with the real world after sitting at a desk for a long time.
So you and I were talking in the green room, I guess we can say, before the event started, about the time it takes us to write books. And I didn't plan on asking this, but since we began the show this way, what is the moment in the writing process where you're hunkered down working on this very private, very, focused, private thing that it dawns on you, oh gosh, somebody might read this. Does the writing process change for you? And does that moment come halfway through the manuscript, 3/4 of the way through the manuscript, or when you're looking at the galley proofs and proofreading it? What is that moment like for you?
Well, it's certainly very close to the end. It's a long time before I'm confident that that it's going to work out.
Mhm.
I write by trial and error, which I do not recommend. I don't have any technique. I have never managed to develop a technique. This is actually my 4th book now, and you'd have thought that I'd have figured it out, but sadly, that is not the case. I have great difficulty getting ideas, and the books are very character driven. So generally speaking, I start with a character who comes to me or doesn't. In the case of A Town Called Solace, it was a year before I had anything at all. And then I got an image in my head of a child, a little girl, standing at the window of her home in this little town called Solace in Northern Ontario, a very remote community. And looking at the house next door, she can see through the side window of her living room into the side window of the house next door, and she sees a strange man carrying in 4 boxes. And that was all I had in my head. I didn't know who she was or what was in the boxes or who the strange man was. And I thought, well, okay, how does she feel about this? And I thought, I think she feels cross,
Mm-hmm.
which was my first inkling that of her personality, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
And why cross? Well, maybe this house belongs to somebody that she likes and she thinks she's looking after it. Oh, I know. It's an old woman who has gone into hospital and who has said, please, will this little girl, whose name I decide is Clara, will she look after Moses the cat while the old woman, Mrs. Orchard, is in hospital? And she hasn't come back from hospital, and it's been weeks. And now suddenly this strange man has walked in carrying 4 big boxes.
Mm-hmm.
So that was how it began. And then it evolved over many, many drafts and many, many years, and ended up having 3 central characters. And the story rotates through the 3 characters. They get a chapter each and then repeat.
And that was all so beautifully said. And the 3 characters, of course, that little girl's name is Clara. And the house belongs to a woman named Mrs. Orchard, which is one of the all-time great names. And the mysterious man who's carrying these boxes is one Liam Kane. And can you tell us a little bit about each of these characters as individuals? And given that you are such an organic writer, and I always hope that I always hope when we have a discussion like this, I always wish we were in person and we were having a cocktail or coffee, and maybe the audience was just eavesdropping, because this is the kind of discussion that feels religious to me, and that so much of what we do as writers and what you're describing is so mysterious and so inexplicable. And it's almost like talking about religious faith, and we don't know quite how to put it into terms, but we watch these people and we spend time with these people that we create that also strangely feel real. And we wonder what they're going to do. And we try to find, as you said, when Clara is looking at this house and she feels crossed, we try to find those tension points where we know a story is going to strike. It's like flint from these tension points, and there's going to be a spark. And we try to warm our hands by it and keep it going and keep the story proliferating somehow. And so can you talk about these three individual characters and the ways in which the tensions between them, real or perceived, drive this novel, and how they kind of drove you through the process of writing it over the years?
Yes, well, I thought, having started with Clara and the strange man, that I should probably deal with the strange man. He should be another character in here. And I absolutely could not get a grip on him at all. I couldn't figure out who he really was. So I abandoned him for the time being and focused on Mrs. Orchard, who is in hospital. And she has, well, basically her heart is giving up on her. She's getting on. And she's looking back over her life to an event that took place 30 years earlier, when a family moved in next door to her. And she was not living in Solace then. She was living in a city called Guelph in southern Ontario. And she was childless, and a family with children moved in next door. 3 children, 2 little girls, and a much younger boy, a boy aged 3. And Mrs. Orchard is very drawn to the little boy. And I thought, okay, so the little boy is Liam Kane. He is the man next door. So we're going back 30 years from Clara, which gave me problems. I mean, writing in 2 different time frames is not ideal, but this is what I mean. It kind of grows, and then you're left dealing with the problem of how to make it all work. But anyway, there was a great crisis in Mrs. Orchard's life, and it caused a tragedy for the family of Liam Kane, and specifically for Liam himself. And at this stage in her life, as she's coming to the end of her life, what she would dearly love to do is make amends, but she doesn't know how she can go about this. So I thought, all right, okay, I do know something now about Liam. There was a terrible tragedy in his life, and it involves his relationship with his family, specifically with his mother. And the question for me was, and the most interesting question throughout the writing of the book, was to what extent can a child who has been through trauma and grown up in very difficult, deprived circumstances, to what extent can he overcome that as an adult? And that gave me kind of a handle on Liam Kane. I'm very fortunate in that my sister is a clinical psychologist. I just studied psychology as an undergraduate, but she's the real deal. And I consulted her a lot in terms of what the effect of childhood trauma is, that you carry with you into adulthood. And we spent a lot of time talking about that. My sister and my husband are very much involved in the books. They read every draft and we talk about them. But Liam Kane, I now realize, is going to have grave difficulties forming relationships with anybody. And I decided that he's a city boy. He has arrived from Toronto because he has been given this house by Mrs. Orchard. And it comes at a fortuitous time because he is He has just divorced his wife and he has just walked out of his job and emotionally is in an exceedingly difficult place. So he comes north to see this house, do it up and sell it, and get back to civilization as soon as he can. I should say that this is set quite far north in Canada, where it really is very remote, and there aren't, or there were not at that stage, all that many things to be said for it in terms of culture and entertainment. In fact, nothing. I mean, there is one street and it has the basics, and that's it. But very shortly after arriving, about 12 hours after arriving, he gets a visit from police, and it seems that he is suspected of a crime. And the crime that he is suspected of concerns Clara's sister, her older sister, her adored older sister. Clara is 7 and her sister is 16. And her sister has had a flaming row with their mother and walks out saying, "You will never see me again." And they don't see her. And it's been 12 days since she left, and there's been a police search and no sign of her. So that is what Liam is suspected of, being in some way involved in whatever has happened to Rose.
And what I love about the novel is that you have this broad central plot, the missing girl that ensnares all of the characters. Obviously, it's Clara's sister, it ensnares her. It ensnares Liam because he's, the chief suspect. It ensnares Mrs. Orchard because it's her house where the suspect's living in. But within that, each of these characters has their own central arc. So as the narrative is progressing, their characterizations are also progressing and doing really interesting things. It reminds me a little bit of another writer we featured, Jill McCorkle, another North Carolina writer who had a book called Hieroglyphics. And another writer named Gail Godwin, who had a beautiful book about a decade ago called Flora. And I'm thinking about the ways in which you staggered these characters, Clara in the innocence of youth, where the suspicion she feels toward Liam is almost an invigorating entree to adulthood, right? To the complications of adulthood. Liam is struggling with trauma. Mrs. Orchard, maybe feeling indirectly responsible for that trauma. But you're giving us such a sampling of the generational approaches to the story. And I'm wondering about what you were thinking about these quiet domestic lives, the quiet domestic life, especially in the northern reaches up north of Ontario, how these quiet domestic lives oftentimes hide these flaming, passionate, painful existences. And I wondered if you could talk about that, how you found the fuel to drive each character forward, whether it was, Clara's suspicion or Liam's tragedy, and how the gloss of domesticity can kind of shelter the viewer from that, the casual viewer, not the reader, but maybe the viewer.
Yes, and it's one of the most interesting parts of writing, actually, to figure out, to develop how the character is going to evolve over time and how their relationships will evolve and the extent to which they'll affect each other. Now, Clara's situation, it seems to me, you see on television parents interviewed absolutely distraught because a child has gone missing. You do not see the siblings, if there are any, which is quite right. They should be protected from that. But it seemed to me that it must be absolute hell for the children, particularly the siblings of a missing child, particularly if they're too young to really understand what's happening. And Clara's parents will probably try to protect her by saying that everything is all right and that Rose will be home soon. And 7 years old is plenty old enough to sense that everything is not all right. Mm-hmm. She can tell that things are desperate, that her parents are desperately worried about Rose. But in her terms, they keep lying to her. And her teacher at school does the same. She says, it'll all work out, Clara. You wait and see. Yeah. I promise you this is going to get better. And of course, Clara doesn't believe that either. How can she know? So she is partly driven, Clara. She's a tough little character, but she is driven by her grief about her sister going missing and fear because she doesn't understand why nobody will tell her the truth and why her parents are trying to pretend everything is still all right. Now, her circumstance is pretty much the same all the way through that book, whereas Liam's changes very significantly from his childhood, which you view through Mrs. Orchard's eyes until he comes north to this small community. He is monumentally unimpressed with Northern Ontario and particularly with this little town and specifically with the food, which consists of either burgers or poutine, which I don't know if you have poutine down in the States. No, it's French fries and gravy and cheese, melted cheese. Those are the two options. That's it. No menu, nothing else. That's it. So it doesn't occur to him to cook for himself, of course. You get flashbacks with him of his relationship with his wife. She was his first and only relationship with any human being. And both of them were desperate for it to work. And basically, they did not choose well. And he is trying to, it has simply reinforced his very considerable self-doubts and the trauma that he is still suffering from. So the impact of moving to this strange place where people keep asking him questions, that tends not to happen so much in cities. You know, people don't question you. They don't even look at you. They pass you in the street. Whereas everybody there is interested in Liam, and he just wishes they would leave him alone. And then I still couldn't get a really good handle on what he was like. How did he speak? I do find that when I'm creating a character, one of the best techniques is to put them with another character and engage them in the conversation and see what they say. And there is a scene in the book where Liam walks into his house, Mrs. Orchard's house, and finds Clara standing in the living room. And I thought, so what will he say? Will he say, what are you doing here? Or what's he going to say to a little girl? He has no experience with children at all. They are a foreign species to him. And when I realized what he would say, I suddenly knew who he was, what sort of man he was, simply by the first word that he says to Clara. And that was a breakthrough moment. That was when I thought, this might work. This might work. And it was the moment you were asking about where I thought, okay, so we do have potentially a story here. And that was a good moment. Well, that was several years into the book before I got there.
That's just so fascinating. And again, I hope some beginning writers, or maybe some struggling writers, or people who are feeling stuck in their own manuscripts, are watching this. And that simple advice of, if you don't know a character, put them with another character,
Yeah,
preferably an unlike character, to
yeah.
see how they interact. One thing that really excited me about this book is that it, like writers like Elizabeth Strout, um, or maybe someone like Stuart Onan, who are obviously American writers, you look at domestic life as being rife with just as much tension, just as much tragedy, just as much uncertainty and suspense as the most action-packed thriller we could ever imagine. And I find that so invigorating as a reader, and so hopeful as a human, especially in times like this when we're all closer to home, we're all perhaps feeling a call to home, we're worrying about our family, but that we can turn to these rich interior lives of people either in our families or in our neighborhoods, and we can find these connections. We can also find these mysteries. We can find these challenges. Just this afternoon, my 4-year-old and I were driving home from lunch. We met a friend from lunch. We were coming around the corner in our neighborhood, and our yard is on the right-hand side, and we have a fence. On the outside of our fence, we have a swing and a tree and a hammock. And there was another family playing on our swing and in our hammock. And my 4-year-old said, "How do you think they got here? Do you think they think it's a public park? Do you think?" And then we came inside and we watched them through the window, and we discussed all these possibilities, like maybe they think they're us, maybe they think they live here, and it was just so delicious to see her such a charge out of something that wasn't a superhero, wasn't a ghost,
No.
wasn't, violent per se. And I just think it's so refreshing that there is this turn in literature, and your book is certainly part of that, that finds these quote unquote small lives and small places,
Yeah.
and cracks them open and reveals such complications, such grace, such beauty, such tragedy. And I just think it was just beautifully, beautifully done and
Well, the thing
discussed.
is, we all are the central character in our own lives. And the things that happen to us, and we all experience tragedy and disappointment and despair, along with, if we're lucky, the positives.
Mhm.
And they are very important to us. I mean, everybody now is going through COVID, and everybody has been affected by it in some way. And you're right about relationships. You're right about finding them within books, and also finding them within communities, because I mean, we have been deprived of our children and grandchildren. We haven't seen our grandchildren now in over a year,
Oh, wow.
because they live too far away to visit for a day. Um, and we're not allowed to stay overnight anywhere. So, everybody is suffering from the absence of the people that they love. And that is a personal tragedy for everyone. And then there are those who have lost loved ones. So, yeah, it is the small lives that we identify with, because most of us lead small lives. Not too many of us are adventurers and mountaineers. And
Sure.
you know.
So I want to remind everybody, if you have a question for Mary about this book or about any of our others, just go to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Make sure to mention your name and the name of your home bookstore, and I will ask Mary your question. But before we turn to the audience questions, and there's some questions that are lining up, can you talk a little bit about your writing process? You said that you take a long time to write a book, you sit with ideas, you wait for that moment, the scene between Liam and Clara where you think, oh, this might work. What is your writing process like on a day-to-day basis, or maybe on a sit-down to sit-down basis?
Well, it's a day-to-day basis. At some stage when you are considering becoming a writer, you have to decide whether this is a hobby or a job. Mm-hmm. And I initially started off writing short stories, and had a bit of success with them and thought I would like to try a novel. But I did this because my children had started school, and there was no part-time work in my field. And so I wanted something that I could do from home. I didn't want to go out full time. So when I had some success with the short stories, I thought, okay, I'm going to try writing a book. And I talked with my husband about whether or not we could afford for us to earn nothing for a couple of years, for me to earn nothing and just live on my husband's salary for a couple of years. In fact, it took me 5. I'm really slow, and I decided that because I'm so slow, I needed to work at it every day, at least 5 days a week, and sometimes 6 days a week. And so I sit down each morning at it and read through what I wrote yesterday, and almost always delete it. Mm-hmm. And rewrite it, start again or go in a different direction and progress a bit, if I'm lucky, in the course of that day. Although sometimes I will spend a whole week rewriting the same scene until I get it right. And I don't seem to be able to move on until I've got things right.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating.
Yeah, well, again, it's very inefficient because sometimes you find later on that you have to change things. They're not fitting. One character is not fitting, say, in terms of time with another. So you're going to have to make changes. In one of my books, I discovered partway through that my principal character was going to be 19 in 1939, in other words, at the outbreak of the Second World War. And suddenly, I was going to have to write about the war and how it affected Northern Ontario. I had to make a complete change of course there, and it took me well over a year to incorporate all of that into the book. It was very difficult. So I don't recommend my way of writing. I just keep redoing it until it sounds right. And then I give it to my husband and my sister. I said to each of them early on with my first book, Crow Lake, which didn't get published until I was 55. So it took me a long time to get there. I said, would you be capable, if you read this, of telling me the truth? Because otherwise there's no point in you reading it. It's just a waste of your time and mine. And they both said, okay, yeah, I'll tell you the truth. And they both do, which can be a source of considerable friction, I have to say. They're not allowed to confer. And if they, I give it to them independently. I send it to my sister in Canada, and I give it to my husband here in the living room. And if they agree about something, not having conferred, if they both say the same thing, then I take it seriously. But if they disagree, then I go with my own feeling. And occasionally,
if you disagree, you break the tie.
I break the tie. I get the casting vote.
That's fantastic. Sometimes I'll give something to my wife and say, I need you to read this but only if you can say good things.
Yeah, there's no point.
You have to promise me on that. I need that. We have some questions. Sandy from Toronto. Many independent bookstores to choose from, but I'd go to Book City first. Why did you name the town Solace?
That stems back to an earlier book, The Other Side of the Bridge. Oh, yes, my husband has just said from the other side of the room, no, it wasn't Rodens, the other side of the bridge, it was Rodens. He's right, it was. Where there is silver mining taking place in Northern Ontario. And thousands of men stampeded up there. This is true. It was the second biggest silver mine in the world.
Wow.
That they had going up there. Thousands of men stampeded north, and some of them took their wives with them. And the conditions that they had to live in were really rough. They lived in camps around the mines, in tents. The women had their children in those tents. They raised their families in the mud and the snow and the slush and the diggings from the mines. It was really, really primitive. But eventually, if a particular mine was successful, then people would build a cabin or eventually a house, and a town would grow up about it. And I thought, now for the women, this is just going to be incredible. There will be 4 walls and a roof for a start. Not much more than that to start with, but still, that's a lot better than a tent. And neighbors with a door to knock on, and a school for the kids to go to, and a church, and maybe even a store. You never know your luck. And they will name the town, and they will call it Comfort? No, Solace. So that's why the town is called Solace. Now, it would have been founded roughly, I mean, the silver rush started in 1903, so 1905 or 6, whereas this book is set in 1972. So things have changed a lot in Solace since then. But as you were saying, small lives still have their tragedies, and people are still in need of solace. And I thought, okay, that'll do for a name.
Speaking of people's lives, Barb, her bookstore is The Bookkeeper in Sarnia, Ontario.
Oh,
and Barb asks, can you talk a little about the policeman and his role with Liam?
I was really lucky with the policeman. One of my brothers lives in the north, and I said to him, I need a cop who was a cop up there 50 years ago. Is it more than that? Probably is now. On his own. Would you know anybody who was up there? And he said, oh, sure, yeah, I'll take you to see him. His name is Bill. So I went to see Bill, who is a retired policeman, and he worked in the north all on his own, responsible for 3 small towns and a whole bunch of lumber camps. And I said, that must have been really rough. Was there backup? Was there someone to call if things got tricky? And he said, where? You know, there's nothing, there's nobody.
Yeah.
You're on your own. And I said, would you ever enlist a member of the public to help you? And he said, I did whatever it took.
Wow, that's great.
And I thought, great. That means I can give Carl Barnes, who is the cop up there, free rein to give Liam as hard a time as he wants. Basically, he's the law.
Don't you love those magic moments? I was at an event down in Florida one time, and a guy at a car service, I was visiting a library, a car service picked me up. And the guy from the car service who was driving asked me what kind of plane I flew in on and had a bunch of questions about the aircraft. And turns out he had flown aircraft, some for the United States government and some for private. And he had flown a particular plane that I was writing about called a DC-3. And I said, hey, how much cocaine would fit inside of a DC-3? And just like that, he said 10,000 pounds. I said, you are the guy I want to talk to. And so we talked.
Exactly right.
Yeah, we talked. Well, this has been an absolutely wonderful experience. Helen in Copperfish Books down in Punta Gorda, Florida said, I would love to have coffee with you anytime. She has been enjoying the conversation.
Well, that is entirely mutual.
As have I. So thank you so much, Mary, for giving us so much time. And thank you all so much for joining us for another edition of SIBA Reader Meet Writer. We'll be back on Thursday evening with Denise Bryce and discussing her novel. So please join us then. Look at the calendar online for this wonderful series we have going, and let's keep it going. But Mary, again, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
And you can get some rest and go to sleep.
Good night.